morning we're down to chapter 1 and down to verse 21. When we get down here, we're going to be talking about the evidences of God. But the reason we're going to be talking about the evidences of God is because this is a way that Paul is approaching the subject. So now keep this in mind, that he starts out by giving his salutation, his hellos, and then he comes down and then he gives us the theme of the book. And the theme of the book is that man is saved by faith. And we learned that in the gospel. The gospel is God's power unto salvation. The theme is that man is saved by faith. Then he goes into the next section that we talked about last week in verse 18. And he says, now here is the reason that man needs salvation. And that is because they have sinned. The wrath of God is against all ungodliness and unrighteousness, and they have sinned there. So that today is where we're going to pick up our subject and take a look at how Paul proceeds with this. Now what he's going to do today is he's going to look and see what sinners have done to God, and then he will conclude with what God has done to sinners. And so this is a very important part of laying the foundation of what he's talking about just a little bit later on of salvation by faith. Now, as we started out this last week, we started out talking about this particular verse here. For the invisible things of Him, since the creation of the world are clearly seen, being perceived the things that are made. Now, we got to go back, and this actually is where we began the class today. Now, he's going to show us that every human being on the face of the earth, ever since there has been an earth, from Adam and Eve down to now, every human being living in every country, every continent, farthest back in the bushes of Africa that you can get, every human being has had an evidence presented to them that there is a God. So this is what Paul is wanting us to see, that there's not going to be any such thing as coming to the judgment bar of God and telling Him that we just didn't have any opportunity of knowing that there is a God. So now he starts out here talking about this, for the invisible things of Him, since the creation of the world are clearly seen. Now we'll talk about those invisible things in just a moment. But notice he said, since the creation of the world are clearly seen. That is, there are things about God that are invisible that can't be seen. And yet they are clearly seen. And you say, well, how can things that can't be seen, that are invisible, how can they be clearly seen? Not just might be seen, but they are clearly seen. It is just a clear understanding of this. Now here are the invisible things of God. That is His everlasting power and His divinity. So through looking at the creation of the world, Paul said, you can see these two things. You can see the power of God, and you can see the divinity of God. Now, as you look at these two things, you look out and you see all of the universe that's round about us. You don't need a telescope. You don't need any of our modern technology. You just look at the earth itself and see all the things that anybody can see around it, and it is just absolutely so big that you can't possibly believe it. The more technology that we have, the more instruments that are invented that enables us to look farther and farther and farther into the universe, then this becomes even more gigantic as every day goes by. And so we just stand and just shake our head at how powerful God is. How powerful is He? Look at all the things that He has made. Now, if Rod down here is telling us that he's the most powerful man on earth, that he is really, really a strong individual, now we might stand back and we laugh at Rod, and Rod then says, look, now I'm going to hold you responsible for this. Everybody in this class, I'm going to hold you responsible. If you will accept me as being the most powerful man on earth, I'll give each one of you $1 million. But if you don't, then I'm going to do harm to each one of you. So you've got a choice to make. You can't just say, well, I'll just let it go. So here's your choice. You're either going to accept what he says, he's the most powerful man on earth, or you're just going to turn around and let it go, or you're going to reject it and say, no, he's not. But there's a consequence either way you go. One way there's a reward, one way there's a punishment. So now we look at Rod, and we say, well, does he look like the most powerful man on the earth? He says he is, but is there any evidence that he is? Now let's suppose that he walks up here in front of us, and he picks up 500-pound weight, and then he drops it into one hand, does 20 push-ups here with this 500-pound weight. And then he says, now add another 2 of those 500 pounds on it. Give me 1,500 pounds. And so he starts in. And suppose he says, now add a few more. Give me 5 tons. And he just picks up 5 tons of weight and does this. Now, is that enough for us to believe, yeah, he's the most powerful man on earth? It just absolutely, you see, yeah, he's the most powerful man on earth. So you look around and you see what God has done. You see what he's made. You see how big the earth is. And you've got to say, it boggles the imagination of man, the power that there is in the Creator. But then, the next is divinity. And that's the question, is there a Creator? Is there a God? Is there any evidence that there is a God? Do people all around the world have evidence that there is? That's what divinity means. It means that the evidence that there is a God. Now, he says, as you look at the creation, that you can clearly see these invisible things, which is God's power and his divinity, that he is, that they may be without excuse. So now, nobody is going to be able to stand before the judgment bar of God and say, God, I didn't know. Now, you might say, well, has the gospel been taken to all of those pygmies in Africa? Is there anybody in the world that hasn't heard the gospel? Might be. That's not even an argumentable point. That's not what Paul is saying. Paul is not saying to everybody who has heard the gospel and rejected it, that's not what he says. He says nobody will be able to stand at the judgment bar and have an excuse of not believing that there is a God and that he is an all-powerful God. Now, this is an important thing for us to see, because this is God's plan. He's given us this evidence right here. So nobody's going to be able to stand there and be that way without excuse. Here we have in Psalms 19 that well-known passage of Scripture. The heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech or language. That is, you don't have to know a certain language to get it. You can speak any language of the world. Their voice is not heard. You're not listening for an audible voice. Their line is going out through all the earth. It's everywhere. Everybody can see it. Their words to the end of the world, and in them hath he set a tabernacle for the sun. That is, he says, you can look up and you can see in creation, and you hear a voice. You can hear it. It declares something, although you don't hear it in any particular language. You look at the evidence that you see out in creation, and it's going to tell you something. In Acts 14 and verse 17, when Paul went into a city and they worshiped him as a god, he stopped them. And he backed off and he says, no, said, I'm but a man. And then he talks about the great God. He said, and yet he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and given to you heavens from heaven, rains and fruitful seasons, filling your heart with food and gladness. In other words, here he says, you even had witness to the fact that there is a God by the seasons that he's given you, and the fruit, all the food that you always have that is available to you. Even by looking at these, he said, you can know this. Now, there is a logical conclusion that all reasonable people can see by just looking at the universe. That's a point that Paul is making right here. He's getting to that before he gets to this, before he gets to the gospel. Now, I come back to hit this again because it is a concept that is so often misunderstood. People think that people are lost in the world because they haven't heard the gospel or they haven't obeyed the gospel. That's not it. People are lost because they have sinned without the gospel. They've sinned and they stand condemned. And the gospel is the medication that is brought in to heal these people of their sins. So God, the Bible, starts out without the gospel. So we put the gospel down and we say, now, can people have any evidence, any relationship, you can put it this way, with God without hearing the gospel? Yeah, before people ever hear the gospel, they have this evidence that they see that shows that there is a God. Now, as we look here, we say, when anybody looks into the universe, we have some decisions to make because it is the evidence that there is a God. That's what the Bible says. The Bible says if you want evidence that there is a God, don't go to the Bible. Sounds funny. If you want evidence there is a God, don't go to the Bible. Because somebody just picks up the Bible and it says there is a God. Is that any evidence that there is a God? If you pick up a book written by the Muslims, will it say that Muhammad was the great prophet of God? Does that prove it, that he is? You'd say no. No, just a book saying it doesn't prove anything. We've got to work our way through before we get down to the gospel. First of all, is there a God? And if there is a God, has he written the Bible? And can we prove that he's written the Bible? And then you start taking the Bible and say, now we have all of this evidence. So, just starting out, you look into the universe, wherever you are, darkest jungle of Africa, wherever you are, and there's evidence up there that is saying that there is a God. Now, the evidence, of course, is accumulative. Thousands and thousands and thousands of arguments that there is that shows all of this. I just want to give you one that I've gone over here several times, and we're not going to get into any scientific statements here today. But as you look out, everybody has to wrestle with this conclusion right here. You have to come to a conclusion that something does not exist, there is nothing, or that something does exist. Now, every one of us in this building today has come to a conclusion, and we knew this without doing any thinking about it. And you say, Lowell, why would you even put this up and start with it? Because that's the stupidest question that you could possibly ask. Does something exist? Are you here? Now, the only reason I start out at that particular point is because that's the point where atheists will start out. They go back and they will have to conclude that they don't know whether anything exists or not. They don't know whether they are here or not. They will say, I've heard them say this, they will say it, many other people that have gone through scientific courses and so forth will hear them, that I'm not sure that I'm here. I couldn't prove that I'm here. I think I am, but I may just think that I am. And so you say, well, who's the guy that's thinking that you might be in here? And they say, well, see, it just may be like a dream. We don't know whether we're here or not. See? And this is their whole premise, because if they answer this question in the wrong way, they know they're shot down. They know that if they say something does exist, we're going to come back and say, where did it come from? And we're going to ask more questions about where did it come from. But now here it is, that you have to make up your mind on this. Now, if there's anybody here today that says, well, I don't think anything exists. I don't think there is, I think there is nothing out there, nothing anywhere. I don't have any help for you. Neither is the Bible if you don't believe that you're here. But we'd say, well, no, that's ridiculous. Everybody says something does exist. Yeah, I'm here. Here. There's a wooden platform up here and so forth. So something does exist. So then we raise the next question. this something that does exist, there's only two options. It came from nothing, or it's always been here. Where did this something come from? You look out into the universe, and you say, well, it's there. I see the stars. I'm here, and you're here. There's things. I see it. Okay, now, where did it come from? There really is only two options, and that is that it either came from nothing or it came from something. And when you say, well, when it comes from something, what do you mean something? Well, something, it came from something that's always been here. In other words, either something came out of nothing or something had to come from, the things we see come from something that has always been here. You have no choice. You have the two options. You say, I either believe something came from nothing, or I believe something has always been here. Well, all you got to do is look around and you say, well, could something come from nothing? You think on that about 3 seconds, and you come to your conclusion, can something come from nothing? Now, scientifically speaking, science has tried over the many years to try to bring something out of nothing. And, of course, they've totally failed. What they try to do a lot of times is take these bell jars and pump them out and put a vacuum in there and then squirt a little unusual gas in and then put some electricity in and try to cause various things to happen. But when they do that, they're always doing it with something. Everybody knows that something cannot come from nothing. Well, if it can't, then you say, well, that's just logical. Any pygmy in Africa would know that. Then you'd have to say something has always been here. You say, I don't know what it is, but there has to be something that has always been here. Now, rather than jumping straight to say, see, that proves there's a God, let's look at it in this way. Now, that's something that's always been here then. It's either physical or it's not physical. Those are your only two options. That's what you have. The universe, you look around and everything you see in the universe is physical. We're here. We're here. Now, where did we come from? Well, we had to come from something. Well, where is the something we came from? I don't know. Well, what was it made of? Well, I don't know. Well, it was the something that made us is either something that's physical or it's something that's not physical. It could be either one. It could be either one. So then you say, well, is there any evidence on either one of these? Is there any evidence that you can give? Well, as you look at A, the something that's always been here is physical, and science, all science recognize that that's not true. It can't be true. It can't be true. Now, they've tried to concoct different theories on it to show that it is physical. They'd give anything to try to show that it's physical, but it's not physical. Everything that you know in this universe is running down. It's deteriorating. It doesn't make any difference what it is, whether it's your clothing, whether it's your shoes, whether it's this building, whether it's you yourself. Everything is running down and deteriorating. Now, if it was physical, and all science recognizes this, it's one of the basic laws of science, that all things physical constantly run down and cannot be eternal there. So it can't be eternal. Now, this is what caused people to make up this theory called the Big Bang. They say, well, okay, what if it was this? What if you had this thing that's material, and it's always been here? It's always been here, this material thing. And it was just a small thing. It was as small as the point of a pin. It was just like a cell. It was so small that the human eye can't see it. It's always been here. Then one day something happened and caused it to explode. And when it exploded, it went out and it formed the universe. And the whole earth and the sun, the moon, the stars, everything was really compacted into that little cell-like creature thing that was so small you couldn't see it. And when it exploded, there's so much material in there, it caused the universe. And so it just keeps going out, and it goes out, and it goes out for billions of years. They think probably 15 billion years, and since the last one. And then something happens and causes it. Now, you know the universe is going out. It's exploding. It's going away. It's going out that way at the speed of sound, 186,000 miles a second, going out that way at 186,000 miles a second. In fact, it's going out faster than that because it continuously speeds up, they tell us. But now, here it is, going in all these directions, 186,000 miles a second. That's how fast it is expanding. Now, something happens. Nobody knows what happens. Nobody knows when it happens. But something happens that causes it to reverse. It turns around and comes back in. And comes back in and compresses and compresses and compresses and compresses all the stars, all the universe, all the earth, compresses it back down into the size of the head of a pin. And then something happens. Nobody knows what happens. It explodes again. And out it goes. So it's been doing that for eternity. So it's physical, see, for eternity. That's called the Big Bang Theory, when it explodes and goes out. Not one whit of evidence that you have in the whole thing. And all science will show in anything that they can see is that really cannot be true. But so what if you're going to take science and look at it? Well, you would say, well, no, something that's always existed could not be physical, because you look around and you can see that. Well, if it's not physical, then it has to be not physical. Now, what is the word that we use to call something that's not physical? It's here, but it's not physical. We talk about angels. Angels exist, but they're not physical. What kind of a being do we call them if it's not physical, see? Now, it's spiritual. We call those things spiritual. Now, our word for the spiritual thing that has always existed, eternal, is God then. In other words, you can just look at that and you can see, just starting out without all of the other evidences, there has to be a spiritual being that has always been here. And that spiritual being has to be so powerful that he could create all of the heavens and all the earth. Anybody can see that before you ever get into any scientific formulas or any instruments to take a look at that. That's what verse 18 says. That's what the Bible says. The Bible says that is what you can see when you look into the universe. So we can see the power and intelligence of God by looking at what He made. So that's the whole point. So he's saying anybody in any country at any time can look around and they can see without any doubt that there has to be some kind of a spiritual being. Now, if these people have this, say, okay, there is a God. If anybody says, now there is a God, now keep in mind, so far, we haven't taken the gospel to them. Anybody in Africa, I'm picking that out, I'm trying to get the farthest away from us there can be. Now, anybody that's out there, and they can see that there is a God, what would be the next logical thing that anybody would think about if they came to the conclusion there is a God? And we see it in every nation. In every nation. The question is, what would that God want me to do, isn't it? What would He want me to do? Now, there's where many people start out with themselves, and they say, well, I think, and so they start out, and so they start making idols. And we look at all the nations around about us, every nation that's ever existed then has either believed in the one true God, or they've gone into idolatry, trying to figure out how they serve their God. There's never been a question of any nation not having the evidence that there is a God. Now, when they have this evidence, there is a God. Now, if they are a truth seeker, And this is an important point because it applies to you and it applies to me. And we can be just as guilty as they can be. Truth seekers. If there's anybody that looks out and says there is a God and I want to obey Him, I want to know what is right and what is wrong. Now there, God has given a promise in this. God has said, ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened to you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. For a truth seeker, you always have to work at it. You always have to knock on the door. You have to seek it. You have to work at it. What is the truth about any given subject? See? What is the truth? Now, if these people are truth seekers, that God has given us some things to let us know what He will do. If any man will to do His will, he shall know of the teaching, whether it is from God or whether I speak from myself, Jesus said. If you're really seeking, He told those people, you will find out the truth. You're going to find it out. One time when Paul was talking to a bunch of heathens, it said, we also are men of like passion with you and bring you good tidings and so forth and so on. He said here, who in the generations gone by suffered the generations to walk in their own ways. Yet He left not Himself without witness. See? Now He let them walk out there in their own ways, but He was giving them witness of who He was. There is a God. See, that's the important thing. Now when a person comes to the conclusion, there is a God, and I want to know what God would have me to do, there's where the providence of God is going to come in. This is God's part. This is not yours and mine. God will see that the truth is taken to those particular people. See, when those things happen. Now, last week, we learned that all nations have been influenced by the laws of God. There's no nation on earth that can say, this nation has never been influenced by the laws of God. We went into that in detail. Now then, we add these other two. Everyone in every nation has the natural universe that teaches them one thing. There is a God. So you look out. Now, God's promise to every seeker of truth is that he will find the truth. That he'll find the truth there. Now, this is where the gospel comes in. Because the gospel is that truth that is going to be sent to these people. And the reason why we're to take the gospel out to these people is so they can really find the truth. John 17:17 says, thy word is truth. Now, as we look at mankind, we take a look at what man has done with the truth, with the knowledge here of God. So now we're going to pick up here our story in verse 21. It said, because that knowing God. Now here he's talking about all these people and all the world. Everybody knows God. Everybody knows there is a God from what they see. This is what he says. He said, because knowing God, they glorified him not as God. So that's the next thing. When people didn't glorify him as God, glorify means hold in high opinion, recognize and honor for who he is. These nations didn't glorify him and accept him really as God, neither gave thanks, since they not going to bend their knees to a God. They're not going to give him thanks for what all he's given them, but became vain in their reasonings, and their senseless heart was darkened. Now those two go together. When people look out, they see there is a God, then they reject God. From that moment on, they become vain in their reasoning. Anything that they reason, anything they try to figure out, doesn't have any substance to it, doesn't have any foundation. It's like trying to build a house in the air without having a foundation. Your house is no stronger than your foundation. And if you don't have a foundation, you're not going to have a house. Now, you may play like you have a house. I may get up here and say, see this house I built last night? See this house? It's right here. It's here it is. Right here's the first floor. Here's the second floor. Y'all see that house? Yeah. you know what you'd do with me if I started talking about that. If there's no house there, if there's no foundation that is there, you would know that. Now, any reasoning you have about how you should live that's not based upon the foundation of God is vain. That means it's empty, it's void, it has no meaning. Any way of life is that way. People turn to idols. What does the Bible say about idols all the way through? See, the same thing. And so it's vain their reasoning. Now their senseless heart was darkened. They don't have sense enough to accept what the evidence shows, and so their mind now is darkened. It has no light. They don't know where to go in all of this. But professing themselves to be wise, now when these people do this, they always act like they are wise. If you were to ask who projects themselves as the wisest people on the face of the earth, it wouldn't be hard to let us know, would it? That is that the people here that, they claim to have all this scientific evidence, evolutionists, all of these people of this nature, they profess themselves to be wise. But he says they became fools. And that's really what you are. You're really a fool. I've seen on the Western Washington, University of Washington, over in Pullman, one of their professors stand and debate. He was debating Sam Dawson, and he was showing that there is no God, and he stood there and defended the fact that he didn't know whether he was there or not. Now, how do you even argue with that? See? So Sam said, well, do you believe that I was up there talking just a minute ago? He said, well, I think you were. He said, but it may have just been a dream. It may have just been an appearance. I'm not sure. Well, are you up there talking now? I don't know. I'm not sure. Now, here's this great man professing himself to be so wise. But how wise was he really when he was defending it publicly that he didn't know whether he was there or not? And so you become fools when you do that. There's just absolutely no question about it. Now, when you become fools and you've given up God, the next thing is then they gave up God and turned to idolatry. So the way he puts it here then is professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God for the likeness of an image of corruptible man, of birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. That's where idolatry comes in. That's why nations are full of idolatry, is because they've gone through this process. Not because they don't have evidence there is a God, but because they've gone through this process and then turned to idolatry. And here in America today, we've done the same thing. We don't have as many idols as most people have, but we have all kind of idols that we're placing our hope upon to save our nation and to save a whole lot of other things. So Paul shows us this now is the downward spiral of mankind. And he's showing the reason that mankind are in that sinful condition is because of what man himself has done with the knowledge that there is a God. Now next week, he'll go ahead and he'll finish this, and he'll show once you go into idolatry, then here is the next thing that you can expect. Okay, class dismissed.